Okay, it is Tuesday the 26th. And there's my iced tea. Gotta have my iced tea. Oh, you're safely out of the picture, don't worry. You're the most camera shy person. Anyway, you notice, question number 1. Who wants to take it?
Why is the material in this chapter important?
Mm-hmm.
History is the foundation of all surveyors.
Oh, that's in that little box, isn't it?
No, it's not.
Oh, okay,
It's not
you underlined it.
Yes.
Okay, basically, anytime you do a retracement, you're doing history. You're basically doing a historical analysis, but unlike most history majors, you have to locate things on the ground. And you look at a lot of history, and they're really uncertain about where certain things happened. So that's where surveyors have to be different. We also, like I said, when you're doing a survey plat for a boundary, you are guaranteeing the location of that tract. You are not actually guaranteeing the title to that tract. And this is something people don't really comprehend very well. And so the history is really important, but if you're surveying in the square states, states other than, basically north of the Ohio and west of the Mississippi, most of those states are square. They have right angles at their corners because they were laid out with the public land survey system, which meant they were surveyed before they were actually settled. You had some settlement in the region, but they did not patent or did not grant land to people under the PLSS until the survey was completed. Now, people got there beforehand, and so if you had a grant from, say, the previous Spanish administration, that was grandfathered, that was honored. If you had it from the French, honored. If you had it from even Russian, it was honored. So you have to know the history. Can you imagine being a surveyor in New York City? Do you know how many different administration type things they had to deal? Who surveyed or who settled New York first? Dutch. So you've got, Dutch law, and then you have English law. Then you had the American law. But basically, New York owns its own land, like Texas. Kansas never owned its own land. That was all federal. So you have to know the history of the area. So when you say all surveying is local, all history is local too. And the history of the area determines the surveying that you do. But a lot of the stuff in here is really useful for study as almost like Trivial Pursuit. Because, okay, what act created the public land survey system? Yeah, you highlighted it, but do you remember it?
No, I haven't applied the memorization of it.
Mm-hmm. And then 10 points extra. What land created the idea of public lands? And it was real. Basically, it wasn't the ordinance of 1785.
What land?
What ordinance created the idea of the public land to be distributed? And it's somewhere in here, but it's not in a good order. First off, what ordinance created the public land survey system as we know it? And they're going to go by date. And I'll take the year. I won't necessarily hold you to the month and the day. Theme from Jeopardy is going through my head. Okay, I'll cheat. 1785 created the Public Land Survey System. And that basically instituted the idea of the government extinguishing the Indian claims, first off. No one could go and buy land from the Indians. So only the government can make those deals. The land would be surveyed prior to settlement. And so that was the Act of 1785. Now the Act of 1784 created the idea of public land to be distributed. They did a lot of work back then. I mean, 1783 was the year we got independence from Great Britain. And oh, why did we bother fighting the Revolutionary War? What was one of the main? This is not in the chapter. This is, so I'm not requiring you to know it from this reading, but you better know it by the time you finish this chapter. Why did we go to war with Great Britain? Why did we declare independence? What was the straw that broke the camel's back? Taxation was one thing. When we fought the French and Indian War, one of the things that was promised to people who served in the army was land. When they signed the treaty with France, basically divvying up the North American continent, the Brits forbade settlement west of the Appalachians. That meant George Washington, who had all this land decided on in Ohio, he'd already, surveyed it. Well, he couldn't develop it and sell it. So this is not in most history courses. But basically, you had an army that had been cheated out of its payment, because that's what the militia officers and regular troops fought for in the French and Indian War, was Western land. And the troops who served at Valley Forge, what were they fighting for? What reward were they looking for? Western land. So when when the Treaty of Ghent was signed in 1783, all of a sudden, everything to the Mississippi was available instantaneously for survey and settlement. Where did they do most of the practicing? That's in the book. What did they, practicing on? How do we survey all this land? Ohio. God help you if you ever have to survey in Ohio. There were the very first ones to be settled, to be surveyed and settled, were for military veterans, and that was the 7 ranges. And they very quickly found out that, this is a bigger job than we thought. And so, do we use the magnetic north for the compass for north? Well, that seems like a good idea, doesn't it? What happens? Compass gets deflected all the time. And if you're smart and don't want to end up like Gene with all your hair missing, you keep a rifle handy. And what happens when you keep a rifle near a compass? Yeah. So, if you, basically, let's just say that after 1783, the Indians were really pissed. And they knew if they saw a surveyor coming, this was not good for the tribe. So anybody with a survey instrument from Ohio all the way down to Texas, the Indians got onto that real quick. If you're a surveyor, you're the one who's chiefly responsible for their land being taken. So they didn't like surveyors a whole lot. But Ohio has more different rules for surveying than any other state in the union. And it's just, you know, it's sort of considered a public land survey state. Where is that little map with all of the, you know, this is
227.
227, yeah. Okay, you see, all these basically, if it is north of the Ohio and then west of the Mississippi, it is public land survey states. Now, Mississippi and Alabama are exceptions. They were surveyed because they were basically vacant. Florida went all the way to New Orleans back, yeah, we didn't own Florida back in 1783. But by 1819, we signed a treaty with Spain, and they basically gave us Florida. But we renounced our claims to Texas. We were kind of crossing our fingers. But that was the Adams-Onis Treaty. And essentially, Texas used to go, or the Mexican claim used to go up, way up, you know, into Kansas and then into Montana and then across to California. And that boundary was signed off on by the U.S. in 1819. And when we fought the Mexican War in 1846-47, that boundary got changed to what you, well, almost what you see nowadays. But all of these states were surveyed on, it was the largest surveying job in history, was the disposition of the public lands. And really, Chapter 9 is all about the particulars of how they went about doing it. When I talk about Tiffin's instructions in 1815, well, before that, the Surveyor General was on the site, not necessarily on the site, but he was in the territory being surveyed. Tiffin's health just wouldn't allow for it, so he wrote down instructions. That's the first set of written instructions to the surveyors. And that laid out what a district surveyor must do himself. What are the two main jobs of the origination of a public land survey? What are the two things you have to do before anything else can be done? You got to do that. It's a long way to Pennsylvania.
I'm sorry, the baseline and the meridian?
Yeah. Basically, you have to run your base. Actually, they ran the baseline first. They decided what the principal, you know, what the point was.
Right.
And they ran the baseline, then they ran the meridian.
Right. But then, since
everything hangs off that like a Christmas tree. And like I said, prior to 1815, there were no written instructions. It was being done. They were developing yet. And the idea of the rectangular system was primarily Thomas Jefferson's. Thank God for that. He may not have been the smartest person in the world, but he listened to the smartest people in the world. And that's why the public land survey system takes into account the curvature of the earth. And so you can take a baseline and run another baseline, and then run another baseline every 24 miles for 200 miles, and the system holds together. It's truly an amazing piece of reasoning set forth on the ground. God, I wish we had it in Texas. Our jobs would be so much easier when you go looking for monuments. In Texas, you might, as you well know, you might have to go 20 miles to look for a monument sometimes, if you're out in the railroad surveys. They may or may not have been located on the ground originally. That was not allowed in the public land survey system. Okay. Oh, yeah. Page 224. Look at a mispronounce it. Circumferentor. what does it look like?
Sextant.
Well, it's not really a sextant, because a sextant has mirrors. This thing is just two sets of sights to allow you to get a baseline and an angle. It's actually an even older instrument laid on its side. And that's one of those 4-point questions for the SIT exam. What's an astrolabe? Because they used astrolabes on the Mason-Dixon survey, apparently. They were used mostly for astronomical observations. But if you lay it on its side, it's a dandy tool for turning angles. So if you're actually running a baseline east-west, meridians go that way, baselines go that way. And you have the North Star, you have 2 points on a due north line because you were given instructions as to how to shoot the North Star at the apogee. You have western and eastern elongation, which is the side of the orbit. It's not an orbit, it's just the Earth is slightly, not on center with Polaris. But if you shoot Polaris at exactly the top or exactly the bottom on that almost 24-hour cycle, then you are on true north. And, that's within a half a degree, which is better than most people can do nowadays with modern instruments. They, in that big thick book I gave you, the PDF copy of, each one of the instructions to territorial surveying gives you an example of how to establish a basis based on a Polaris observation. So this circumferenter is nothing more than an old astronomic instrument laid on its side so that you can turn an angle. And if you have something that measures angles and you have a compass attached to it, similar to our transit in the back, and you write down the angle turned from your 0 point, and then the bearing, and then note the deviation from true north, that's a lot of information in one field book. It allows you to know, are you keeping a true north track, and do I have a magnetic variation? Because they kept the bearings with the compass and they kept the angles also, so that you would know what kind of deflection. Okay, every one of these idiot antique units of measurement is fair game on the SIT exam.
Really?
Absolutely. Not only that, he said, when you take the RPLS exam, I would seriously consider studying all the Spanish units of measurement, in particular, up to and including knowing what the Spanish word for foot is. But basically, know what a cordel. What is a cordel, by the way? This is outside of the stuff we've been studying, but you'll get it next semester. Cordell was Cordell Walker's first name. If you ever watched Walker, Texas Ranger. Cordell is a waxed rope used to measure land under the Mexican administrations. It was 50 varas long. I think it was 50. It's either 50 or 30. You'll get to study it, don't worry, and you will be quizzed on it. This, Chapter 9, is a lot of the stuff that you're going to get quizzed. It's going to be what you think of as throwaway questions on the SIT exam. Like, what's a groma? You see it in the front part of the book. Groma. Groma is a Roman surveying instrument. And it kind of looks like a little lampshade, like it's hanging off this little arm You shove it in the ground, and it's got a plumb bob that comes down over your point. And then you can get it online with whatever you're supposed to be online with. It's got 4 little tiny plumb bobs at 90-degree angles. You line up, and then you walk over to the other side, and you're looking at a 90-degree angle. Romans loved 90-degree angles. They hated curves. So when you look at old Roman roads, didn't matter about the topography. The road ran straight. And there are some great YouTube videos about Roman surveying. If you can put up with the guys in the funny costumes. The Roman civil surveyors were just, they did some amazing work with truly primitive instruments. Okay. Let's look at question 2. What distinguishes the land subdivision system of the states east of the Mississippi and south of the Ohio? In other words, all those states with the little lines, you know, the diagonal lines on page 2, what did you say, 237?
227.
227. There it is. All of these states, you know, like the colonies and then like Kentucky and Tennessee and then Texas. What's the main difference between those states and the PLSS states?
They were surveyed as it was needed, not
Yeah. And,
before.
yeah. What do you call that?
Indiscriminate land survey.
Well, sort of. Basically, they're something and something. You use it all the time. Meets and bounds. And an adequate description of land in the square states is, you know, like Township 3 North, Range 2 West, such and such baseline, such and such meridian, and then parts of, you know, like the section in that township and parts of that section. And that's a full legal description. And it goes from the very smallest to the very largest. It's an elegant, elegant system, which we don't use in Texas. But if you don't pass the SIT, you don't get to use anything in Texas because you won't be practicing surveying. That's why this is important. It's a hurdle. It's like knowing all of the different anatomical parts if you want to be an EMS technician. EMS technicians do not say, would you hold the bleeding on that thingy there? They have to know the name for the part. And you have to know the names of all this stuff you're dealing with. So if I make you say, you know, if I say, how long is a 2-pole chain? It's in the book.
I know it. 2-pole.
A 2-pole chain, how many, first off, how long is a chain?
66 feet.
66 feet.
Okay, how many poles are in a chain?
4.
Okay, therefore,
Pole chain, so 33 feet.
33 feet, yeah. Basically, a pole was the wooden part of a truly nasty late medieval weapon that was used against heavy cavalry. It was kind of like a can opener on a stick. And the mounted knights in heavy armor, they were the spam. And, you know, as soon as you developed that, it was basically just a pole axe. Very pointed thing with kind of like a fork. And that stopped. But if you planted one end of that with your foot or another person's foot and then held it for the opposing cavalry to charge onto, the result was not pretty for the horse or the rider. That's why it's called a pole. So one pole was 16.5 feet. So that you could hold it up and still get traction on the ground. And when the rider hit it, all hell broke loose. So that was late medieval warfare at its finest. So they had all these poles. What do? Well, you start measuring things with them. And 2 poles is 33 feet. 2 poles is basically a half chain. People used half chains because half chains were easier to use than whole chains. it's easier to use a short measuring unit or a short measuring device, a chain like that. Have you ever done much chaining in heavy brush?
Chaining?
Chaining.
Got
Anytime you use a tape, it's called chaining. But basically, if the longer the chain, the less convenient it is to use. Because if you're on rough terrain, do you measure on the slope or do you measure horizontally with a chain?
Horizontal.
Anybody else done any
How
chaining?
it's supposed to be done?
How it's supposed to be done.
Horizontally.
So basically, with a chain, you're always getting a horizontal measurement. It takes a lot of work to get it, but you're always doing, and that's why on the PLSS system, it's always assumed, unless proven otherwise, that it is a horizontal measurement. What do you call that presumption?
Presumption.
What flavor of presumption? Because,
It can be proven wrong.
correct, that's it, that's all you have to say. So there's 2 questions on the SIT exam you just got. So basically, a chain is always supposed to be used horizontally. So you are getting horizontal measurements. It's a pain in the butt to do because you have to, what's the 2-word phrase for maintaining horizontal measurement with a chain? Break chain. That's another question. I'm not saying it's always going to be on every SIT exam, but this is the kind of stuff you need to know. It's the little details that they will try and get you on. So in addition to knowing, okay, this is a baseline, this is a meridian, this is a township, this is a section, the little nitpicking questions about, oh, what's a groma? Same number of points. So, however, don't count on them grilling you on, say, the land surveys in Virginia, because that was, primarily, all that was done prior to independence. And so it was done according to the finest in English civil law, which was guaranteed to get people in court just as often as possible. At the conclusion of the Revolutionary War and our settlement with Britain, how far west did our holdings go? How far west did we get, when Ben Franklin finished with the Brits, when he was negotiating with them? How would you like to be on the other side of the table from Ben Franklin in a negotiation? How well do you think you'd do? Not very well. How much land did we own, United States? In other words, what did we make out with? By the way, we almost got Canada. Ben Franklin was that far away. So it was the French who made us stop. He was on a roll. He almost got a good part of Canada. Would have been interesting. But anyway, how far west did we go?
The Ohio River Valley.
Well, no. How far west did we actually, did the Brits cede to us? Think in terms of a natural boundary.
Mississippi.
Mississippi River. What was on the west side of the Mississippi River? Who owned that land and when?
Mexico.
Okay, when did Mexico become independent? Actually, it became independent before Spain said it was independent. Yeah.
Okay.
So who in 1783, who owned the land west of the Mississippi?
Spain.
Spain. And the French, basically, the French settled. The French had settlements all up and down the Mississippi. Why? Who did that little bit of exploration for them?
and Clark.
Nope, too late, yeah, too late. They're much later than that. Who explored the Mississippi River? Why do we have towns named Des Moines?
Somebody French, I guess.
Yeah, somebody French. Yeah, Cartier. So basically, it was French exploration. St. Louis was a French settlement. It was where the Mississippi and what is that other river? Is it the Ohio? Yeah, basically, it's at the confluence of two rivers. I think it's the Ohio. But anyway, St. Louis was a French settlement. And New Orleans was a French settlement after they got kicked out of Newfoundland, which later became, Newfoundland and Nova Scotia. That used to be French. So they came down and learned how to, eat crawdads, and, bake king cake and all sort of neat stuff. But basically, west of the Mississippi belonged to Spain. Now, who did we buy the Louisiana Purchase from?
France.
How did France end up with all of that real estate? Napoleon. He took it, and so he ran short of money and then sold it to us. The French were furious. If you're going to steal it, at least keep it. But basically, now, I'm asking about this on account of one thing. In Missouri, prior to 1819, there were settlements that were still considered Spanish. And who went to Missouri to mine lead in like 1819 and later went on to become the father of Texas?
His father takes his live.
Stephen F. Austin's father was named
Stephen G. Austin.
Moses. Moses Austin. Moses Austin, when he went to Missouri, applied for, and this is not in the book, this is for your own Texas history. It'll come in real handy when you take the RPLS. When he went to Missouri, he got Spanish citizenship. Therefore, because Missouri was at that point a Spanish territory. Therefore, when Moses Austin applied to be an impresario in Texas, he got to the head of the line because he had Spanish citizenship, which went directly into Mexican citizenship, right? Which then put him at the head of the line to send his son down. And it's one of those, it's like one of those James Burke moments in history. When the world changed because of one thing, it was because Moses Austin, when he crossed the Mississippi to go mine lead in Missouri, got Spanish citizenship. So basically, it's not real simple. The borders, boundaries were not all that simple prior to the, prior to the settlement, because you had, I know that, like the Louisiana Purchase occurred in 1804, but that land, there were parts of that land still claimed by Spain. And it wasn't until after the Adams-Onis Treaty, which you will have to look up at some point, that the line between the Louisiana Purchase, which was then, from that point on, U.S. territory, and Mexican Northern Territory was established. And so, history can be interesting, but what distinguishes the land subdivision system in the states east of the Mississippi and south of the Ohio is that it was pretty much meets and bounds. you had certain areas of Georgia was one of the last areas to be settled as a colony. So it was a little bit more organized. But when Florida was ceded by the Spanish, they started moving down from Georgia, and they did it with a rectangular survey system into the swamplands. Okay, question 3. Why memorize ancient and obsolete units of measurement? Not just because I told you, but because that's what they'll use to trip you up on. And bits of history like this. What's the Doomsday Book, or the Doomsday Book? And who was responsible for it? That's in the book. The Domesday Book was instituted by William the Conqueror. And first thing he did when he got over to England and took over completely was to figure out, okay, I need money from taxes. How do I get money from taxes? Well, I start giving land to people who supported me. But I have to note how much land they have. In other words, the idea of a land inventory was completely foreign to England at that point. So that was the point at which you started having recognized boundaries for entities, for parcels. And once a year in an English parish, they have, like usually close to Pentecost, what they'll do is that they'll beat the bounds of the parish. And so the priest and the altar boys and anybody else who wants to come along will literally walk the bounds of the parish, from marking stone to marking stone to monument to monument, whatever. Once a year they do that. So that's how they know, it's by those physical descriptions when they walk those. They're actually walking the meets and recognizing the bounds. So the Domesday Book was William the Conqueror. And that was simply a way of noting who had what and how much tax can I get from it. Now, what do you call a survey done for the purpose of appraising the value of a piece of property? There's an actual word for it. Begins with a C. Cadastral. And in the public land survey system, basically the rank you need to have to resurvey land in the public land survey system is you must be a cadastral surveyor, and that's recognized by individual states. There is no national license. Each state issues its own license according to its own qualifications. And that's a cadastral surveyor. And it's another Greek word that you just got to put up with. And you have to know it, you have to memorize it, because you can't guess at it. But a cadastral survey is for the purposes of assigning value. And, the Domesday Book, it's called the Domesday Book because if you ever got hauled before the king, it was to determine your doom. That is, what you would be required to do. And it was kind of like end of the world for a nobleman to be called before the king, to give a full and proper accounting for his estate. Not the sort of place you want to be that day. A lot of the words for property law are French because England was invaded by a bunch of Norman French. And they were basically leftover Vikings, the Normans. And they came down, they settled in what later became known as Normandy, and they perfected the art of war. So that William and his army really made very short work of the Anglo-Saxon last king, Harold. To give you an idea of just how good Normans were at organization, 7 Norman knights defended Malta from a siege. 7 knights. They had a little help, but that basically they understood fortifications and they understood defense as well as offense. They also understood law. And so a lot of the words you're going to hear in this course have to do with Norman French culture. One of them is cecine. What does that mean?
Delivery of possessions.
It's actually possession of the possession. Okay, how many people here have actually gone through a marriage ceremony? Okay, got 1, 2, 3. Okay. To what and to what? Till death do us part?
Who wants to fill in the blank?
Yeah, fill in the blanks.
Oh, love and marriage,
Hmm?
honor and obey. I mean, there's a bunch of them.
Yeah, but to what and to what till death do us part?
To have to hold.
To have and to hold. Basically, the foundation of the marriage ceremony is a property arrangement. You know, hate to say it, but that's what it is. That's why the father gives away the bride. And that's why the bride had a dowry. And to have is not the same as to hold, but to have complete and total possession with title. You have it and you hold it. And to hold can be up to and including to defend by force. So, cecine is simply, when they call it the livery of cecine, kind of really odd phrase, but all that means is that the person who has the title delivers that title to someone else, but that someone else must have and hold it, or else you do not have cecine. And cecine is necessary to title.
Well, for how long though? What if they intend on title or deeding it to someone else?
That is, if you have ownership in fee simple, that is, complete and total ownership, then from that moment on, you are at liberty to, what is the correct word for selling, giving, etc. title? Anybody know that word? And it's actually, that word is in the Declaration of Independence. It's called alienation. You alienate property. And these are the words that are not in this section, but we need to have another vocabulary review, because you acquire title, you alienate property. Now, in the Declaration of Independence, there are some rights that are unalienable. That is to say, there are some things that are so important, you cannot let go of them. You cannot sell yourself into slavery. You cannot make an arrangement with a person for that person to kill you. Although, how do you collect on that bargain? No, there are some things that are so important that you cannot alienate them. You cannot sell your children. Tempting as it might be on occasion. But no, there are some things that are so important they cannot be done. You can alienate property. Now, if you are under obligation to creditors, you can't sell land that you have mortgaged and refuse to pay them. So you can't alienate that land if you don't own it thoroughly. So while you're still paying on it, you don't have full ownership of it. So you can't alienate it. You have it and you hold it, but you just haven't paid for it yet. So certain conditions have not yet been met.
Well, then how does that work if someone sells their house, then pays off their mortgage? You know what I mean?
Yeah, because they then have the money to pay off the original note.
So if it happens in a quick succession like that, then
Yeah.
it's okay?
Oh, it happens in a very orderly succession, or you go to jail.
Gotcha.
Yeah. But basically, Cecine is just one of those. And in Texas, it used to be very common in the Mexican administration. When you got your land, you would like grab grass and throw it into the air. You would fire a pistol at every corner, when you're walking to the next corner, that gives you enough time to reload, I guess. But you made it very clear to everyone around you that this is my land. You have it located on the ground, and everybody is required to recognize your boundary. We went over what is a circumferentor. Basically, it's nothing more than a protractor with sights, but it was an astrolabe blade on its side. Look up astrolabe, A-S-T-R-O-L-A-B-E. Do a wiki search on that. You'll see. It was normally used for astronomic observations to get the height of like a star or the moon or the sun. Oh boy. Question 7. How does Chapter 9 define title? Because I brought up other meanings for title.
Title may be defined as the legal basis of foreground or land ownership and may be transferred by descent to heirs or by the purchase.
Okay, there is a phrase that they use throughout a lot of property law, and it's called bundle of rights. And not every ownership of every piece of land has the same number of rights. In other words, you might buy a piece of land that has a lease on it so that someone else can mine coal. Well, that works for that half a section, but it certainly doesn't work on a subdivision lot in Happy Farms subdivision, where you've got a lot that's 100 feet by 200 feet. You generally don't want people coming in mining coal on your subdivision lot. So that's a right you have in your subdivision lot where it doesn't exist on that half section, because that half section is basically, it's a coal mine, it's a strip mine. You can have a piece of land where you have leased it out to others to farm. You have the full enjoyment of the proceeds of that land, but the person who has the lease has the right to the quiet enjoyment of growing crops on that land, right? The state has the right, if it determines necessary, to build a road through it. So, you have basically you have some rights. Two pieces of property can be identical and be side by side and have different bundles of rights. It all depends on what has been promised concerning the land by previous owners and what you have promised as owner of that land. It's, used to be a very common complaint against a holder of an estate that he was allowing the land to go to waste. Hence the phrase wasteland. Wasteland was simply land not in production. And the heirs could sue the holder, the head of the estate, for allowing the land to be wasteful. That is, not generating income. So that's another thing about property law. This is why I've simplified my idea of title down to, you only have so many rights as the law says you have, and the law is willing to enforce with force. So anyway, Chapter 9 defines title, as having, but it's also that bundle of rights. And so when you take the SIT, they won't talk about my definition of title. They'll talk about bundle of rights. Answer it to please them. Unless, of course, I get to write the next SIT, which probably is not going to happen. Okay, we sort of went over why is Texas like the original colonies and Kentucky and Tennessee. Tina, you've been too quiet. How is Texas basically the public domain in Texas like the original colonies?
It's non-PLSS.
Well, non-PLSS, but who owns it?
The state
Or who
is-
owned it?
The state is.
Basically, Texas owned its own land. The colonies owned their own lands. Kentucky and Tennessee owned their own lands. Florida didn't. They were Spanish. Spanish were pretty much through with it by that point. How many different survey systems are in place in Ohio? I think it's 9. I'm not sure. That would be a really good subject to, bring up at the beginning of next class. How many different survey systems are there? And there's a little diagram if you go into PLSS and Ohio if you want to wiki that. Okay. Why did Ohio have so few grants prior to the Revolutionary War? Goes back to the historical question. What was Ohio?
Indians.
Yeah. The Brits said it belonged to the Indians.
And
And,
they said, never mind, y'all go, we're going to give it to the soldiers.
well, that's not what the Indians said.
Well, I'm sure, but
The Indians
Was
were
that the
really
goal?
not pleased with this arrangement because they'd pretty much backed the Brits in the Revolutionary War. And they lost, and boy, did they lose. So essentially, about all that's left of the Indians in that part of the country are the place names. And it was part of the settlement process. But, Ohio was where Washington's was supposed to have land to develop after the French and Indian War. And then he didn't. So he was a land speculator as well as being a surveyor. What land did the Louisiana Purchase include, and what was excluded?
Texas was excluded.
Yeah, because, we didn't know the boundaries. But basically, look at the map on page 227 and just sort of, whoa, how big is that Louisiana Purchase?
Well, but it went up the Mississippi River, right?
Goes up the Mississippi,
And then it came over.
basically to the Great Lakes, all right? So all of this stuff, like Ohio, Indiana, Illinois, Wisconsin, and Michigan, and what's that other state? One of these states here. You have the Upper Peninsula of Michigan, then you have there. I guess that's Wisconsin. Minnesota. Minnesota's on the west side of the Mississippi. I'm a little rough on my Yankee sort of geography. But basically from New Orleans to Minnesota, on over to the British settlements in Washington and Oregon area were not included. But basically, anything that went up to the Rocky Mountains was included. The entire drainage system of the Mississippi and the Missouri rivers was included in the original Louisiana Purchase. Biggest single real estate coup in history. We got it for $4 million. We spent way more money on settling Indian claims. And then south of California, or south of the Northern California border was Mexican, and north of the California border was British. So we settled with the British by about 1830 or so. We finally got over the War of 1812 and all those hard feelings for burning our capital and negotiated well. But basically, from the mouth of the Mississippi, west of the Mississippi, to the Rocky Mountains, north of what Mexico claimed, that was all Louisiana territory. And Lewis and Clark actually went beyond Louisiana territory when they went to the mouth of the Columbia River, because the Brits did sort of claim that, but that's life. The Adams-Onis Treaty determined the southern boundary of the Louisiana Purchase, and that excluded what the areas we now call Texas and Colorado and Nevada and Utah, New Mexico and Arizona, California. And also Florida. The southern line of Georgia was determined, and Florida originally ran all the way to New Orleans. They had the entire Gulf Coast. You know, they had, let's see. So basically, in less than 50 years, the U.S. acquired the Louisiana Purchase. Then the war with Mexico, we got the territory now known as the Southwest, and then negotiated with Britain for the far northwest. You know, if you think history moves fast nowadays, you should have been alive then. Then we didn't have, we were getting territory so fast we could hardly wire home. Oh, telegraph hadn't been invented yet. So it might be it was like a year or two before Lewis and Clark walked back to tell the president that they had found the mouth of the